Welcome to our webinar today on emerging and established Hispanic communities, implications of changing Hispanic demographics, which is being put on by the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. So next slide. Okay, so I'm Michelle Blockland, and Mike Lopez and I will be leading the webinar today. Mike and I are both from Apt Associates. I'm up in our Cambridge office, and Mike Lopez is in our Bethesda office. So Mike is the co-PI of the Hispanic Center, and I'm Apt Project Director for the center. Next slide. So joining Mike down in Bethesda are two of our presenters, Mark Lopez and Cleofas Rodriguez, and then joining us remotely from Tallahassee, Florida, Grzywacz. So Mark Lopez is Director of the Hispanic Research at Pew Research Center. He studies the attitudes and opinions of Latinos, Hispanic views of identity, the political engagement of Latinos in the nation's elections, and Latino youth. He also coordinates the Center's National Survey of Latinos, an annual nationwide survey of Hispanics. He frequently appears in national and international media in both Spanish and English. Today, Mark will speak on the geographic distribution of Hispanics in the U.S., including changes in settlement patterns and population characteristics. And Grzywacz is Chair and Professor of Family and Child Sciences at Florida State University. He's studied and published on the health and well-being of immigrant workers and their children for the past 13 years. Joe's current research is focused on community-based strategies for promoting Latino children's kindergarten readiness while accepting cultural preferences for mother or family-based early child care. And today, Joe will speak on the implications of where Hispanics live for children and families. And then Cleofas Rodriguez is the Executive Director of the National Migrant Seasonal Head Start Association in Washington, D.C. He has served on the National Hispanic Education Coalition, the National Farm Worker Alliance, and as an invited member of the White House Hispanic Roundtable for the Administration for Children and Families. So today, Cleo will speak on the implications for service providers serving Hispanic families in emerging or established Hispanic communities. Next slide. So just as our standard disclaimer, I want to point out that the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, the Administration for Children and Families, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Also, today's presentation is being recorded, so after the presentation ends, we'll be uploading the presentation to the Hispanic Center website. So if anyone has colleagues or friends who you think might be interested but weren't able to make today's presentation, you can share the link to the website or the link to the presentation that we'll be sending around afterwards. And also, you can follow the Hispanic Center on Twitter at NRC Hispanic, and if you'd like to tweet information from the webinar or follow our live tweets, be sure to use the hashtag NRC Hispanic. And then also I'll point out that if you have any technical difficulties with the webinar, you can send a message using the GoToWebinar chat function, and we'll try to help you out. Okay, so our webinar today will begin with a brief overview of the Hispanic Center, followed by some background on our topic of emerging and established Hispanic communities. And then each of our presenters will speak on their particular topic, drawing upon their own research and programmatic experiences. And then we hope to save plenty of time at the end for interactive discussion with our panelists as well as the webinar participants. So our discussion at the end will cover questions that were submitted ahead of time, but also if you have any additional questions or comments based on the presentations today, you can answer them at any time using the GoToWebinar chat function. Okay. So the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families is a hub for research to help programs and policy better serve low-income Hispanic children and families around three priority areas: poverty reduction and economic self-sufficiency, healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood, and early care and education. So we accomplish our mission in three ways. First, by advancing across our cutting-edge research agenda across our three priority areas. And second, by building an extensive network of partners, supporting emerging scholars, and developing a knowledge base and tools for the broader community. So our webinar today is part of this second effort. And then third, we implement innovative communication dissemination strategies. So it's critical to our mission that the work of the center gets in the hands of key stakeholders, such as everyone who's attending the webinar today. And for more information about the center and our products and activities, you can check out our website, HispanicResearchCenter.org. And there you'll see our recent research brief, Preparing Low-Income Latino Children for Kindergarten and Beyond, How Children in Miami's Publicly Funded Preschool Programs Fare. Next slide. Okay, so turning to our topic for today, as we all know, the demographics of the Hispanic population are changing. In particular, we're seeing communities of Hispanic families emerging in new locations across the country, in addition to the more traditional locations for Hispanic communities. So as we've been conducting the work for the Hispanic Center over the past 2 years, this topic has continued to, and we've struggled with how to address the issue in our activities across all 3 priority areas. So in addition to the need to deal with the heterogeneity of the Hispanic population, a topic that's been addressed by some of the prior work of the center, this topic of emerging versus established Hispanic communities represents another important dimension that both researchers and policymakers should take into consideration in their work. And because of the salience of this topic, we thought that it would be useful to the field to bring together leaders in this area to share their thoughts and engage in an interactive discussion to push forward our thinking on this important topic. So we're very excited to hear from each of our speakers today and also to hear the thoughts and questions from participants from across the country. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Mark Lopez.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Michelle. I appreciate it. And hello, everybody. It's good to know you're on this webinar with us, and I look forward to your questions. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work at the Pew Research Center. Next slide, please. And a little bit about some of the work we're doing around Latinos. As you know, the United States prior to 1965 was largely seen as a white-black nation. And you can see that here in looking at the demographic characteristics of the country, at least through 1965. For example, in 1900, 87% of the nation's population were white, 12% were black, and Hispanics made up about 1% of the nation's population at the time. By 1965, those numbers were 84%, 11%, and 4%, respectively. But with 1965 and changes, particularly in the nation's immigration laws, we saw a surge in Hispanic immigration to the United States. Immigration, particularly from Mexico, but many, if not all of the countries of Latin America at some point over the last 50 years. That's led to an explosion in the nation's Hispanic population. Just between 2000 and 2010, Hispanics alone accounted for more than half of the nation's population growth. And today, they make up 18% of the nation's population, according to the latest estimates from the Pew Research Center. Next slide. The population of Hispanics currently stands at about 55.4 million. That's, as you can see, a population that's been growing quite rapidly. It was only about 9.6 million in 1970, but this growth really has been a growth that's happened primarily between 1990 and 2010, and that's really quite striking because when you take a look at how fast this population is growing, it is growing faster than just about any population. In fact, Asians and Hispanics oftentimes are tied for who's growing fastest. But I would note that there have been some changes. More recently, immigration from Latin America has really slowed, and while immigration is still important in driving Hispanic population growth, it's really the births of Hispanics in the United States that are going to be the main driver over the course of the rest of the century. And we've also seen a slowdown in Hispanic population growth. Some of the latest population projections even note that by 2050 or 2060, Hispanics, while they will make up about a quarter of the nation's population, those estimates are down from making up about 30% according to population projections from 2008. So I think it's important to note that this is a population that is changing, and the youth of this population are primarily U.S.-born young people, many with immigrant parents, but for the most part it is a U.S.-born population now. Next slide. Where do Latinos live? Well, this is a map that shows you where Hispanics were most concentrated in the 1980s. Now, these bubbles show you the size of the Hispanic population by county. And if any county is not colored in with either the purple or the cafe color, those are counties that have fewer than 1,000 Hispanics. But you can see where Hispanics were distributed, largely in places like California, along the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly South Texas, South Florida, Chicago, and the Northeast. Next slide. By 2010, Latinos were concentrated in many other places as well. You see population growth in Minnesota, for example. Look at the Atlanta area. In case you didn't know, Georgia actually has the nation's 10th largest Hispanic population, right behind New Mexico. And that's really quite striking because 20 years ago, Georgia was not even close to being among the top 10 of Hispanic states. When you take a look at Central Florida, the growth in the Puerto Rican population there has been explosive over the course of the last 30 years, and that's actually changed the politics even of the state of Florida. And if you take a look at places like the Northeast, Washington, D.C., the Boston area, lots of growth. So really, this is a story of growth and a story of dispersion. Next slide. Look at a different way. You can see this is the share of each county's population that is Hispanic. And you can see the most highly concentrated Hispanic populations, in terms of total population, were in places like the Southwest. Look at New Mexico, look at Texas, look at California, a little bit in Miami-Dade down there in Florida, but for the most part, few places had Hispanic population concentrations of above 5%. Next slide. By 2011, this is what the pattern looks like. And you can see how there's many more counties in places like North Carolina and places like in the Northeast where the Hispanic population share of the total population was above at least 5%. Next slide. Look at yet another way. You can see sort of where the fastest growth was for Hispanic populations between 2000 and 2011. Interestingly enough, Alaska has some of those fastest growing places. I think it's important to note that. There are many Hispanics who are moving to Alaska for opportunities that are up there. But look at North Carolina. Look at Alabama. Look at the central part of the South. When you look at Tennessee and many of the metropolitan areas of the South, we have seen some real growth in the Hispanic population. The same thing is true in some rural areas of the South. In fact, Stewart County, Georgia, has traditionally had, in the last few years, some of the fastest growth in terms of its Hispanic population. And you may be saying to yourself, where is Stewart County, Georgia? Well, it's not near Atlanta. It's not near Savannah. It's not near Augusta. It's actually near Columbus, Georgia. And that just kind of gives you some sense of how dispersed the Hispanic population is becoming. You can see in the Midwest as well, the area around Dallas. Dallas has had a real growth in its Hispanic population, but so has most of Oklahoma. And if you take a look farther north, you'll see in Nebraska, et cetera, some fast-growing counties there too. Next slide. So all of this has implications for how, when we think about particularly children, what share of those populations are Hispanic. Now, of course, we said earlier that 18% of the nation's population is Hispanic. However, the share Hispanic depends and varies on which age group we're talking about. So, for example, among preschoolers in the United States today, that's people between the ages of 0 and 5. 1/4 of that population is Hispanic. Among school-age young people, 24% of that population is Hispanic. And among the college-going or college-age young people, 20% or 1 in 5 are Hispanic. However, if you take a look at, say, for example, seniors, people ages 65 and older, and my mother would have taken offense to the word seniors, I think, so I apologize, Mom, if you're listening. 9% are Hispanic. But you can see that the youth of the Hispanic population is really reflected in these numbers here. And the future demographics of the country are actually with those preschoolers. Those preschoolers actually represent the nation's future demographics by the middle of this century. Next slide. Okay, hit it again. Let's see what we get. Aha. So in 2000, looking at this in a slightly different way, these were the states where 20% of kindergartners were Hispanic. 20% or more, I'm sorry, kindergartners were Hispanic. You can see it's the Southwest, it's Florida, it's Illinois. But look at what's happened more recently. Next slide. It's the share where you have Hispanics making up more than 20% of kindergartners. The number of states where that's happening is actually grown. Places like Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, Kansas, Nebraska, these are places now that where you take a look at their kindergartner populations, 20% or more are Hispanic. Interestingly, if you do a search for the term Hispanic or Latino and sort of take a look in Google Trends where the searches are happening, for some reason Oregon is one of these places where a lot of these searches are happening, and I think it's interesting because it reflects the Hispanic population is growing in Oregon. Next slide. One more. Now, it's important to note that the nation's Hispanic population, and we use this term Hispanic, and we use the term Latino, we use them interchangeably. We use it to talk about a group that is actually quite diverse. And we haven't talked about the diversity of this population at all. But this gives you a sense, at least nationally, what the Hispanic population looks like in terms of its country of origin roots. Now, Mexicans are the single largest group. There's 35 million Mexicans or people of Mexican origin in the United States. They make up 64% of the nation's Hispanic population. Puerto Ricans who live in the 50 states plus D.C., that's 5.1 million people, and they make up nearly 10%. I want to say something about Puerto Rico, though. There's some big changes happening with the Puerto Rican population. There's been a large outmigration of families from Puerto Rico, particularly working families, who have been moving to the United States because of a lack of opportunities on the island. That's driven up the Puerto Rican population nationally and has actually caused a population decline on the island. So the island's population has been in decline for about 10 years now, which is really quite striking. Following Puerto Ricans are Cubans, Salvadorans, Dominicans, Guatemalans, and Colombians, all groups with at least 1 million people. And I have Spanish on here just to show you that there is also a large number of people of Hispanic origin who say that their roots are in Spain. Interestingly enough, that also includes many people in New Mexico and Colorado whose families have been in the United States or in those places for 5 generations or more. They're not Mexican, and they don't consider themselves Mexican, but they rather consider themselves Spanish. So it's interesting when you take a look at how diverse the Hispanic population is. This is just one of the ways, by the way, in which it's diverse. There are other ways, too. It's diverse in terms of its nativity. It's diverse in terms of its immigrant generations. It's diverse in terms of the presence of Spanish language speaking ability. So there are many different ways in which it's diverse, and it actually varies by geography. Next slide. Finally, I want to show you some of the largest metropolitan areas, what the Hispanic population's ethnic composition looks like. So for example, Los Angeles is largely a Mexican population, but it is important to note that the nation's largest Salvadoran community is in Los Angeles. There's actually twice as many Salvadorans there as there are in Washington, D.C., which is the second largest. New York, largely Puerto Rican and largely Dominican. But there is a rising Mexican population, recent immigrants particularly from Puebla. And so when you take a look at New York, it's kind of changing too. It's not really the story of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans as much anymore. Miami, largely Cuban, but there is a growing South American presence, particularly from Venezuela. And for those of you who are from South Florida, you may have heard the term, you may have heard Doral referred to as Doralzuela because it's got so many Venezuelans living there. When you take a look at Washington, D.C., Salvadorans are the largest group here, but this is perhaps the most diverse Hispanic population because it's interesting that neither Mexicans, nor Cubans, nor Puerto Ricans are the dominant group here. It's actually a series of Central American and South American groups. And then in Rhode Island, there you have Dominicans being among the largest, along with Puerto Ricans overall. So those are just some of the important differences geographically to note. And I'd say to sum it up, the Hispanic population is growing. The population is dispersing. We're seeing growth in many parts of the country that 20 years ago had very little growth. And it's important to note that even in some places that are traditional Hispanic urban areas, there is tremendous diversity that's also changing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And now we're going to shift over to Joe Grzywacz, and he's going to talk about some of these implications for where Hispanics live for the children and families. Joe.
All right, so I just want to make sure, can you hear me? Somebody give me a nod? All right, excellent. So it's working. Well, thanks so much for letting me be here. I think this is a really important topic, and I'm going to try to pick up where Mark left off on a couple of things. Next slide, please. I'm going to be showing some pictures and graphs, and these are really just intended to serve as sort of anchors for a conversation. And one of the points that was just made was fundamentally about the rapid growth of the Latino population in many rural areas. These are from the Pew Hispanic website. These are the 10 fastest growing counties in the nation. And as was alluded to earlier, many of them might make you say, huh, what, where is that place? So that's the first thing that I want to point out is that the counties with the fastest growing Latino growth, of course, are largely in rural areas, although not exclusively, but largely in rural areas. And while the numbers of those populations in and of themselves may not be too daunting, let's put that in the context of what the overall population is. So in a place like Stuart, Georgia, which was already mentioned, when we're talking about a total population of 5,000 individuals and 1,400 of them are Latino, and that has largely grown from roughly 200 Latinos back in 1990, you're talking about significant demographic shift in largely rural areas that don't have the capacity to meet the need for that rapidly growing population. And that's what the next set of slides is really intended to illustrate. Please advance to the next slide. The next, this slide as well as the next three, again, are just there to look at. I've done as best I can with my little marker to circle in red those fastest growing counties. And the key point that I want for you to take from this slide as well as the next few is look at where those counties are and think to yourself, what else is happening in these communities? So for example, in that county down in Mississippi, that is was and is sort of a hotbed of substantial racial tension that was occurring in those rural areas. What's happening up in South Dakota, where everybody looks like me and is as white as, no offense, vanilla pudding and white bread, and all of a sudden you have rapid growing Latino growth up in that part of the country. Look in Georgia, where elements of the healthcare delivery system, and this is obviously all about the healthcare delivery system, but the main thing that I want for you to think about is these are places that nobody else on earth is kind of thinking of going to. And it's places where the infrastructure for health, for social services, for education is already taxed because of difficulties in other segments of society. And so this particular slide emphasizes the point that 8 out of 10 of the fastest growing Latino communities are in primary care health professional shortage areas. So that's what HPSA stands for. And so that, of course, has some direct implications, for children and families right off the bat. Clearly, if you're in a health provider shortage area, the population as a whole has difficulties accessing health care. But what about somebody who speaks a different language? So one very concrete example is in one of the places where I'm doing research right now. There is about 228 Latino youth in this county. There is not a single bilingual healthcare provider, and none of those providers have an interpreter to be able to do the translation. And that results in something what most of us take for granted, right? My child, if they want to go out for the school soccer team, or if they want to go out for Cub Scouts and go to camp, they have to go and get a physical so that they can then join that team or join that event. I was just talking with one young man just this past week. His name is Luis. He's 14 years old. He's in 8th grade. That's going to tell you something right there. And he was explaining to me how much he enjoyed soccer, but he couldn't be on the school soccer team because he couldn't get a physical. So that's one story behind what this broad slide is intended to illustrate, is that while the slide speaks to health professional shortage areas, imagine that and compound it in rural areas with rapidly growing Latino youth. Let's step on to the next slide, which is going to illustrate the same thing, except now we're talking about high-need health care. So here it's the same counties that are circled. You get the same impact, but the punchline is 4 of 10 of the fastest growing Latino counties are in high-need mental health care, health professional shortage areas. Most recently, I came from a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was one of those brightly colored segments on the map that was up a few slides ago. And I sat in a meeting that had mental health care providers, physical health care providers, all in the exact same room. And I said, what is your primary need as far as being able to deliver high quality care to the rapidly growing Latino population? And their response uniformly was, we're all fighting over the same 10 translators. So you know, mental health delivery and the sensitivity of mental health delivery, compounded with the absence of language, creates substantial difficulties for parents and children. I was talking with the administrator for the Title III program in Tulsa Public Schools no more than 3 weeks ago, and we were talking about the number of referrals for children who were behind or having behavioral problems in the classroom. And in one day, she demonstrated to me that there was a stack of referral sheets that was at least 1 inch thick. And there was all of 5 people who could try to service that entire service load. So again, it's a map that demonstrates where there is mental health care short, but there's substantial overlap with where the Latino community is growing. And there you can also start to think about in terms of what does that also mean for other health and community service organizations. When I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as we were doing some of the research that's reported elsewhere, I had several people from the local nonprofit community come to me. So think of places like Campfire, think of Big Brothers, Big Sisters, think of Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, those kinds of places. And they were all coming to me essentially asking questions about what is the best way to meet the needs of Latino families, because there's no expertise in the area. And then picking up on the point from the previous presentation about the heterogeneity of the population, in Tulsa, as one concrete example, there was really 2 waves of immigration. In the early 90s, it was largely South Americans who were coming under educational visas to pursue petroleum engineering degrees. They decided they liked it in Oklahoma, they liked the jobs that they could get in the petroleum industry, and they settled out. Fast forward to about 2000, and then all of a sudden the second wave of immigration is largely one of Mexicans from rural Mexico. Guess what? South Americans don't really like Mexicans, much less lower-class peasant Mexicans from rural Mexico. But who did the leaders of the community turn to for resolving the immigrant Latino problem? They turned to the Latinos that came from South America, who don't know anything about the population. And so there was no infrastructure whatsoever in terms of mental health care delivery. If we advance to the next slide, it's just the same thing all over again, except this time we're focusing primarily on, whoops, I have a copy and paste error. This is actually dealing with dental needs. Oral health is fundamental to good development and good health, but here you see that 7 of the 10, again, fastest growing Latino counties are in dental care HIPSA areas. So the punchline here and across the previous 3 slides is that although it's focused on healthcare and healthcare delivery, it's really a barometer for the strength and the quality of the human health and social services infrastructure to deliver programs to parents to be able to provide educational materials, to meet objectives regarding poverty reduction or father involvement, and all the things that this particular group is interested in. The last slide is a different version of the same thing, but it speaks now largely to the early child care need. And the slide is very similar to one that you saw earlier, but the key point here is this is the future of schools and this is the future of the economy. And in many of the places that new Latinos are settling, these rural areas that have challenged infrastructure, we have unmet early child care need across the country, but in these areas it's virtually non-existent for early child care. In one county just northwest of where I am right now, there is a child care provider that has a 1 to 140 child ratio. I can't help but wonder how good that is. I don't put that out there so that place gets rated. I use it to illustrate the point that there's relatively few alternatives for Spanish-speaking families to place their children in quality early childhood and early child care. If you're thinking of it more in terms of the actual systems, when I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was at least 7,000 children in ELL classes. There was 67 staff that were either bilingual or from Spain. That ends up being a 1 to 114 student ratio for learning in order to be able to meet the needs of the curriculum. It's not surprising then that high school dropout rates are as challenging as they are when individuals frankly can get placed into an ELL pathway And very quickly, those students learn that it's going to be hard to get out of the ELL track into the standard curriculum. So therefore, requests to go to work for Uncle Paul or Uncle Raul's roofing business start to sound very good, because the future doesn't look very bright for students. And so the last slide that I have is really just some summary points here that try to put things together. And the main ideas is really that many counties, at least the places where I've done research, are in rural places where there's already substantial need in terms of the health, human services, and social infrastructure, and that continues to be challenged to this day. And it has substantial implications for being able to provide culturally sensitive care, making sure that children are ready for school, and then making sure that human and social service agencies are ready for the circumstances that will inevitably arise, such as a parent's deportation because of being undocumented, while the child is an American citizen and gets placed in the foster care system. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thanks, Joe. So we're going to build on both what Mark has already presented on and what Joe just presented on. And Cleo Rodriguez is going to talk more about service providers serving Hispanic families in emerging versus established communities, drawn upon his wealth of experience across the country with the Migrant Seasonal Head Start program.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the Migrant and Seasonal Head Start program. It really is just it's one safety net that is available to some families in some areas. You know, I mean that's the easiest way to describe it, because whereas we would love to be able to provide services to every child that needed services, obviously the funding is not available to make that happen. So when I talk, I'm going to talk from the perspective of this is one service provider that I've been working with very closely for several years now, and that is a Migrant and Seasonal Head Start program. And so if we could go to the next slide, please. And some of you may or may not be familiar with Head Start and or Migrant and Seasonal Head Start, but Head Start was a product of the War on Poverty back in 1965 that LBJ initiated again in 1965. And it was 4 years later when they recognized that there was two populations that needed more intensive, more specific, more direct or intentional services that Head Start was providing to the general population, and those were students and children of farm worker families, and also students of Native American families. And so in 1969, the birth of Migrant Head Start and also the Native American Head Start. And for us, it was always, ever since 1969, the Migrant and Seasonal Head Start programs have served children from the ages of 0 to school age. And that's unusual because a typical Head Start program was only doing preschool, and that was 4-year-olds. And so for us to be serving 0 to school age was a very unique model that was implemented back in 1969. And again, that was based on the fact that is what we recognized that families in agriculture needed, was that they needed to be able to provide services for their children from birth to school age. And currently we have about 30 grantees that serve about 40 states around the United States. And very many of them, you saw many maps that were illustrated here throughout this webinar, and there's a lot of consistency among where our families are currently residing or where they migrate to during the time. It's very common to all the demographics and the states and the areas that were presented by Mark and by Joe here. So it's not surprising that we would see that that is the case. And annually we serve about 30 to 35 children, migrant and seasonal farm worker children. I think it was in 1999, if I remember correctly, when they extended it to seasonal children. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more of that in a few minutes. And again, it's about 30,000. Right now, about 85% of those are migrant and 15% are seasonal. And of those 30,000 to 35,000, about 3/4 of them are infants and toddlers between the ages of 0 and 3. So a significant number are early, or what would typically be served in an early Head Start program. And one of the things that I think that is unique and common to the migrant programs is that our families rely so heavily on transportation services that our programs provide, and it's not uncommon
for our buses in any one of our Migrant Head Start programs to deploy at 4:30 in the morning to head out to the rural camp areas, start to pick up young children. The young children will spend, 30, 45 minutes on the bus, making their way back to the center. It's still 5:30 in the morning, and so the first thing that the children do when they get to many of our centers is they go back to bed. And so the programs are providing a safe place for them to continue their sleep, and then they wake up, have breakfast served, and then the programming will ensue. And the programs will then at 5:30, 6 o'clock, when families are typically arriving home from being in the fields all day, that's when our buses will again deploy and start making the rounds to get children back home for their evening. And so it's not uncommon for Head Start children to have at least 2 full meals, sometimes 3 in a Head Start program, along with a couple of snacks as well. So, and many of our children, much of their nutrition comes from within our programs. And I want to talk just a little bit about an atypical service delivery model, because it is very different from a regular Head Start program, because as in the example that I just noted with transportation, programs are starting as early as 5 o'clock in the morning and running till 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. And when you figure that out, that's a 12, 13-hour day, when typical Head Starts are a 3.5-hour day. There's some current proposed rulemakings right now to change it to a 6-hour day. And when we saw that they were saying a 6-hour day, we thought, well, that would be a half day to a migrant program. So great that you're making that change, but for us that would be a half day. And so and not only are we running for 12, 13 hours a day, but we're doing that 5, sometimes 6, and even 7 days a week. And what dictates that is what are the demands of the agriculture industry in that particular area. So if it's high season in Florida for strawberries, then it's not uncommon for our families to be working 6 days a week. And during that time, a Migrant Head Start program is in full operation, providing services to the children and families that are part of that program. And then and another thing that's very different too is that our programs are not running on a typical school year calendar from, let's say, August to May. Some of our programs don't start until October, when families are starting to make their way back from the northern migration places that they've been during the summer. And so our programs won't open until October, and they may only open for 10 weeks, 12 weeks. But again, it is all dictated by what are the demands that particular agriculture industry have in that particular area. And I can think of South Carolina, where Joe was talking about a lot of immigrants or Latino families are now residing, but there's programs that run maybe 9 weeks there. And basically what happens is families show up, 9 weeks later they are packing up and moving to Tennessee or to Michigan or New York to follow the migration stream. So again, in the best case scenario, we have migrant programs that are set up along those migration streams to provide services to families. If you can go to the next slide, please. And again, real quickly, I'll just say that comprehensive services for children and their families, which include early learning, health development, and family well-being, and Head Start, the uniqueness and the cornerstone and what I think is the strongest foundation of Head Start is the family piece that Head Start, that the authors of Head Start back in 1965 built the program on, was we've got to make sure that families are a part of the education of their young children. And I particularly see that with our families, more so than I see, well, my experience has been more so than I've seen in a regional Head Start, is that our migrant and farm worker families are so engaged in their children's education and I described to you a 10 or 12-hour workday, and despite that, our families are still showing up at 7, 8 o'clock in the evening to go to a training or to go to a family meeting, because they recognize the value and the importance that that's going to have on their child and on the family's well-being. Next slide, please. And I just want to talk briefly, real quick, about the typical farm worker migration streams in the United States. And this is probably some old data here, and
and you'll see what's typically referred to as the three migration streams: a West Coast, a Midwest, and an East Coast. And it's not to say that that families are sticking, straight through these migration streams, because I think that there's a lot of cross-migration that's going on. And many, many things influence the migration stream. Weather patterns influence it, immigration issues influence it. So there's a lot of factors that will influence how families are migrating, or if they're migrating at all. The next slide, please. And so there's always an impact on providers. So there's a constant change of families and challenges with finding qualified staff. There's a lot of turnover in our programs, meeting the needs of dual language learners, culture sensitivity and competence, community impact. These are all the things that our program are having to deal with on a daily basis, and particularly the qualified staff and a staff that is culturally sensitive and competent for the families that are being served by the programs. And more we're starting to see indigenous families that are starting to make their way into our programs, and not speaking Spanish, but speaking various dialects, that our programs are really having to figure out how are they going to meet those needs. And so they're really training within the programs themselves in order to meet those needs. If you could go to the next slide. And actually, go to the next one, because they're giving me the time warning. Some innovative practice and ideas. I think these two other gentlemen took some of my time. I'm going to, complain at them later. Sorry. Some of the innovative practices that I've seen some of our programs have to do, and particularly in relation to our staff turnover, is what we call our migrating teachers. Sometimes the teachers will migrate with the families, and in order to be able to meet the needs in some of these rural communities that Joe was talking about, so that they could create that continuity. And then we also have visiting teacher programs, and again, it's where we'll take programs that are shut down at different seasons and asking teachers to move for a season to particular areas where there's a lot of need for qualified teachers, and also, and I'll give one quick partnership with growers, and in terms of facilities and housing. And I will give one quick example. I saw this in Florida. I think it was in the central part of Florida, where a grower made a big investment in partnership with the Migrant Head Start program, where they actually built a center in the middle of I want to think it was a strawberry field. I can't remember exactly. And then around that center were also some housing, and so the families were able to just walk over, drop their child off at the Head Start program, and then walk over to work. And I think it's a great model when growers recognize the long-term investment that is made when they create partnerships and collaborations like this with some of our migrant and seasonal Head Start programs. If you can go to the next slide. Oh, I think it's just images that were captured. These are just some of our pictures of some of our families and children. So I think I'll end it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cleo, Mark, and Joe. I think for our remaining time, we want to turn to the interactive discussion part of our presentation, and I'll be moderating, and we have a series of questions. We also have been getting questions that have been coming in from participants. So let's start with an overarching question. And this whole presentation is framed as emerging versus established communities and these distinctions, because as Michelle alluded to, it really has come up in all the various studies that we're working on, really trying to capture what are the meaningful differences, when you're doing a study with a particular data set in a particular community, to really try and capture the essence of what does it mean to be studying Hispanics within the context of their communities. So this is an important dimension. So when you think about this notion of established versus emerging communities, do you think of it as a dichotomy or as a continuum? And maybe you can each talk, or once more you can talk a little bit about that. And then can we inform, or kind of the second part, can we inform what we know about established communities? And I think some of you have talked about, especially Joe and Cleo talked about kind of some of the work in established communities. Thinking that can that inform what goes on in the emerging communities, kind of some of what Joe alluded to in terms of the challenges and actually Cleo. So that first community, dichotomy or continuum, which do you think? Who wants to?
It's a good question. We oftentimes think about these as you either are or you aren't, but I do think the question is it a continuum? Yes, I think that's actually one could talk about that, because I think you might ask questions like, what's the share of Hispanic in any given community? And you might imagine that at some point there's some sort of a tipping point where communities really become aware that they have this Hispanic community presence that has perhaps needs that are different than others. Maybe it's 5% of the population, maybe it's 7%, but that suggests to me somewhat of a continuum, all the way to a place like Miami, where it's largely Latino. So you could imagine it that way. But I think that there's it's a lot deeper than just continuum versus dichotomous.
Well, and go ahead, Cleo.
Well, no, I was going to talk about I think we can learn a lot from our established communities. I'm going to take that second piece of the thing here, because I think that our established communities have kind of what Joe was alluding to. So I think a lot of them have learned by trial by error what has worked, what hasn't worked, lessons learned, and I think that it's a time that some of these emerging communities really need to figure out where are, we've identified the established communities and what can we learn from some of these established communities and the service providers in these established communities, because certainly they know what's working and what could be improved upon. So
well, let me push you a little bit on, or the two of you a little bit, and Joe included, because both Mark and Joe pointed out that, and maybe it was a trick question that I didn't even know was a trick question, because in some communities you have, say, I think your example was New York, and I forget which one Joe was, where you have established Puerto Rican Dominican presence, and now there's been an influx of Mexicans, and it depending on the community, there's different dynamics. So is it fair to say? Joe can answer this one. So is it fair to say that it is probably not necessarily either a dichotomy or a continuum, because in some places it's almost like 3D chess, because you have to be careful not to use the same approaches for established communities if you have a different new group that's emerging.
Those are lessons learned.
So Joe, you get the first crack at it.
I'd like to take a crack at that, because I've got 2 or 3 answers, and I'll do them as concisely as I can. And you've already hit the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned, and that is clearly we need to borrow whatever we can from established communities, providing it's relevant. And so in a community that is predominantly Mexican, we can't take best practices from a community that's predominantly Puerto Rican, because guess what? The Mexicans are largely undocumented, low-income, rural, whereas the Puerto Rican example community is a U.S. citizen by birthright, or a refugee, perhaps in a Cuban sense, or Dominican, or otherwise. And so there's very real practical implications that even though they're all Latino, it makes the lived experience very different. So that's one elaboration. The second elaboration that I think is important, though, is also yes, I think that there is a continuum, and it makes sense to be attentive to the continuum nature, especially for kind of research purposes. But I think one of the real challenges is more on the practical side, or the policy decision, and that is by sheer numbers, lots of resources go to established communities as far as being able to help meet the needs of this immigrant community. Yeah. But when you're in small, say, Gadsden County, Florida, that has all of 1,000 Latinos in it, there isn't enough critical mass there to actually get much of any support. And so in that case, I think having some kind of a dichotomy, like some critical threshold, that regardless of what your number is, there are certain allocations that are being made for emerging communities. I think that dichotomy makes some sense in some situations.
Great. Did you?
Joe,
okay.
did a great job.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to jump around a little bit and talk about kind of the child and family well-being aspect of it. We talk often about the challenges in emerging communities, and that families face. I think Joe and others talked about services and what's available or what's not available, providers, and how hard it is. But when we think about various studies that have looked at culturally informed and culturally informed developmental theory that have suggested that living in an ethnically concentrated neighborhood or these enclaves may actually be somewhat protective for Hispanics. What mechanisms do you think may be at play, whether or not it's in an emerging versus established community? So if you have a community of Hispanics that are kind of living together in these kind of smaller groupings, and actually, Cleo, with the Migrant Head Start program, given that you often see very rural, it's much more the emerging communities, but there are probably differences in terms of where there are communities that are just totally out in the middle of nowhere versus those where there's somewhat of a clustering of families that, even if they're migrant, that they may be clustered together in kind of more of a sense of a community.
Well, certainly as economists, one of the things that we think about are enclave communities. And on the one hand, an enclave community can provide resources because there are going to be shops and places, for example, where people speak the language of everybody else. And so these enclaves do have some benefits associated with them. But depending on the size of the enclave and where, it could also have some limiting effects as well, because if you are in a larger community that doesn't speak the language and isn't sensitive to the issues of the enclave, then the enclave can be somewhat separate in a way that's maybe not good for the future of children born in that enclave. However, I would say that with Latinos, one of the things that we see, particularly in the big places like Los Angeles and stuff, these are places where, for the most part, Latinos are directing many of these programs, running many of the schools, have been elected to city office. These are places where Latinos have really stepped up to become the managers of the policy environment that they're facing. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't some challenges with enclaves, but I actually think in many respects the enclaves are providing perhaps better chances and opportunities than limiting chances and opportunities.
So when you go from the enclaves to the broader community, and I think, Mark, some of your graphs that would change over time in terms of the growth, and even some of Joe's growth, graph on the growth, really show that there's been, in some areas, there's been this tremendous growth. Is there kind of a tipping point in a given community where there's enough of a critical mass of Hispanics so that you have more of a sense that the issues that I know Joe talked about and Cleo talked about in terms of service providers and the workforce and the resources for families with enough providers who speak the languages and the different dialects? I mean, what do we think of in terms of a potential tipping point as far as where you have that critical mass?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I could tell you that it's 5% or 10%, but certainly critical mass does matter. If there's only 4 Latinos in South Dakota, in a South Dakota town, in that vanilla South Dakota town, and I like vanilla, by the way, it could that may not deliver any economies of scale as a result of having people around. But you can imagine that in Stewart County, with now achieving almost 2,000 people, that perhaps that will make somewhat of a difference because there's perhaps more of a critical mass of families and people coming together. It's hard to sort of pin that down. I would also say, however, that one of the questions I've gotten from reporters over the years has been, what's the tipping point when you have too many immigrants in a community and the community that these immigrants have moved to start to react negatively to it? So there's another type of tipping point that could be a pushback on sort of what services, et cetera, are provided.
Fantastic. Well,
if I could chime in there, I'd like to throw out something else too.
Sure. Why don't you do a quick response, and then I think we're going to need to wrap up.
Okay. The tipping point question I think is really interesting because it obviously brings into the whole point of power, and obviously things like documentation status and duration of time are also relevant. And so I think it's not really a question of numbers where clearly majority and all that kind of stuff, if they have the right to vote, is useful. It's really the ability to be able to talk about the extent to which that community can leverage some level of power, either in terms of numbers or their documentation status or their ability to organize in some meaningful way, as opposed to just raw numbers.
That's right.
Great. Fantastic. Well, since we're just about out of time, I'd like to close with asking each of you to identify maybe 1 or 2 critical gaps that you think should be addressed with additional either research or programmatic or policy initiatives. Cleo, why don't you start?
Well, so I'm going to come at it from the farm worker perspective because I think that one of the things that really has been so challenging for us is the lack of comprehensive immigration reform, right? I mean, I'm just going to say it. I'm going to put it out there. So I don't think it's so much research, but as much as it is about legislation. And then I also think that we really need to, and I say that because our families, I over and over again, I hear about our families living in such fear and the children living in such fear, and I think it's just so unfortunate that children are living in fear that their parents could, you know, again, because as Joe alluded to, many of our children are citizens and their families may be immigrants, and so just the thought of children living in such fear, and I think that we really need this comprehensive immigration reform. And then I also think that going back to the horrendous agriculture worker conditions in our country, and the poverty that surrounds agriculture work, and how much lack of regulations and the lack of just I guess oh my gosh, policies, or I guess what I'm trying to say is just we really need to do more to protect our farm worker population.
Well, and we will do more together as we work on the National Migrant and Seasonal Head Start study together, but that's another story. Mark, 30 seconds.
I would say that we do need more research. What I'd like to see is more research on the distribution of immigrants, the children of immigrants, and the third generation among Hispanics. So rather than concentrating on just where are Hispanics, let's try to look at sort of what we can find out about their generations. Unfortunately, a lot of the data sources from the federal government don't really allow us to quite get at that because we have to rely on the ACS that doesn't ask about where your parents were born.
So we keep pushing for better data. Absolutely. Data is Joe, 30 seconds on your response.
I'm going to echo Cleo, and I say if 126 families are forcefully separated because of forced deportation, where the child is a U.S. citizen and the adult is an undocumented person, we need to think about immigration status as a family concept, not as an individual thing that can tear families apart.
Thank you, Joe.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to close with a big thank you to our three speakers and to all the participants on the webinar, and to all of the people, Michelle, Julia, and Audra here, who have the behind-the-scenes help, and for all the people who contributed questions, and our Twitter expert here, Marta. As a reminder, we will be posting this recording of the webinar on the center website, and we look forward to additional webinars and other releases. And as Michelle mentioned, we also had a release of one of our other reports. Also, thank you to all of our partners and all the members of our Hispanic Center team and our funders, the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.